Okay, so in this last workshop and second mechanical workshop, we're going to be talking about less like technical things, I guess. So less about like straight mech and more about like how mech looks practically during season and specifically the intersection of mech and CS, which I guess theoretically is the entire robot, but like in the process of things. Um, so I know that this upcoming season is not your standard FRC season. Um, if I'm not sure exactly what it's like, but I don't think you guys are building an entirely new robot or anything like that. So this definitely would apply to like the design and building process if you were building a new robot. But I think you can still like derive the information you need for what you'll be doing this season. And of course, it's relevant for future seasons. So it all starts in the design process. So obviously, like you can just be aware of this stuff preseason, but specifically once you get into the design process. So first, in the design process, you're going to have the brainstorming period, and so you guys will need to decide like how much time you want to allot for brainstorming, and then how much time you want to give to sort of move from that brainstorming phase into when you're deciding on the final design. Because during brainstorming, like you want to get all of the ideas out there, even those ideas where you're like, this sounds absolutely ridiculous, but like it like would work. Because a lot of times those sort of wild ideas is where you get the inspiration for like the more practical toned down idea that you're going to use in the end. But once you start moving past the brainstorming process where there are like no bad ideas to actually deciding what you want the robot to look like and how you want it to work, um, that's when like especially as a mech team you need to start thinking about how like the programming is going to look, and just to keep that in mind, because I think it's really easy to forget that like you can build a robot and have all these ideas, but it actually has to be like programmed in the end. And so we have this great quote from Anand, who didn't know he was making a quote, but where he said, functionality depends on the mechanical ability to do something plus the coding science that makes it actually do it. Because if you're lacking either one of those things, the robot's not going to work. So yeah, this is just basically where you start making sure you're communicating with the whole team, or more specifically, where you make sure the mech side is communicating with the CS side to make sure like, or I said make sure so many times, to ensure that the robot that you want to build is actually going to be feasible. This relates to the idea that we like to come back to based off of some experiences we had our first season of what's possible in theory versus what's possible in the real world, and more specifically, what's possible for the Radicubs. So the first thing is the danger of doing too much research, or like having too much relevant knowledge almost, because what was really common, especially our first year, was there would be these instances where someone would be like, oh, well, in theory, like it could work this way, or we could do this, which is true, but that doesn't mean it's going to work on the robot. And I think we touched on this last week as well. And then that coupled with us having limited experience, it just like puts you guys in very dangerous territory. I would essentially say that unless the team has done it before, it really does have to be thought of as like an entirely new undertaking, because like when you look at the really established teams, or even like this teams that aren't necessarily powerhouses, but if you look at like Allen, for example, most of the things that they're going to want to do with their robot, like either that team has done it in the past or their mentor has done it in the past. And so that really is, I would say, just kind of a limiting factor. Of course, I know there are like mentors who've been interested in the Radicubs who have that experience, so resources like that would be great. But these are just like all things you have to keep in mind. So the solution to this like situation that kind of is difficult is just thinking through all the way down to the tiniest details of what to come when you're in the planning phases. So the examples that I want to use is a good one is the role of an agitator. So basically, what that would look like is if there was a game that involved like a lot of small pieces and they were all being kept in like one central area. So this applies the most to like Steamworks would be a good example, when you could carry like as much like fuel as you wanted, and a lot of people were carrying it in like buckets within the robot. Uh, um, something that's easy to leave out in that design is the role of an agitator, where you have to keep things moving within that bucket, otherwise things will get stuck. But that's just sort of an example of like how deeply you need to think about each idea before you pursue it. And then like going even further, like what would that agitator look like? How would that be built in? What motors would it require? Like what tools would be needed to build it? And all of those things, like have you built something similar before? Some examples that might be more familiar to the mech team that's in this meeting now, because it would these were relevant to our robot last year, is like motor supports and access holes, because like we knew we wanted motors in certain places, and we knew what we wanted our robot to look like, but we ended up having to spend so much time building supports to keep our motors in place and reworking those, and also just drilling access holes to make sure that we could get like the drill in the right place, and that everything could be like connected in a way that made sense. And so that's just an example, because if you're able to think through the details all the way down to access holes when you're designing something, that's a pretty good sign that you'd actually be able to build it. And then the other thing I would add is like when you're designing your robot, right, because you're prioritizing and strategizing. If you're not sure if something's going to work or not, which would apply for anything you haven't built before, if you can answer the question of like how will you troubleshoot, like if you decide like, okay, we're gonna allot this much time for like this subsystem and we don't know if it's gonna work or not, and then you have to kind of know in advance, I think, like at the end of that period of time, like are we going to scrap that subsystem, or like what are we going to do to address the situation in case it doesn't work, rather than like, okay, everything's ready on this subsystem and like, oh my god, if it doesn't work, like I don't know what we're going to do. Because then like when you hit that point, because you're inevitably going to hit that point, then the whole robot kind of falls apart. So moving on to the actual building process beyond the planning phase, this is where Mech and CS should be working in tandem, like during each meeting or during each week, each portion of the build season. And this has very specific applications, such as in the electronics board, because for example, something we didn't do a very good job of last year is like building the electronics board in a timely manner and just like doing the things that are necessary for Mech and CS to work in tandem, and then also just generally checking in throughout build season. The big thing I would highlight here is communication, because I mentioned this in a later slide as well, but a lot of times, like on a meeting to meeting basis, the perception of how the robot's going to work, how a certain subsystem is going to work, and things like that could be changing, right? Because I'm sure like a lot of us have had the experience of like you miss a meeting and you come back and the robot is not what you thought it was the last time you checked. But so long, and then so the danger there is, oh, like, if those conversations are only going on amongst Mech and the CS team is working on coding a robot that no longer exists anymore, like that's just a lot of wasted time. And so the key thing there is communication. And I don't know exactly who was in this conversation this past season, but what I really, really liked, and one of the days I felt like we were most productive, is when there was that day where we all sat down with the CS and the Mech team and we went through every single subsystem with our prototypes, like that here, this is how we want it to work, this is how we think sensors could be implemented. And it was just like a back and forth with people from Mech and people from CS until we had like a common understanding of what the final robot was going to look like. And just sitting down and having that conversation, even though we weren't actively building or they weren't actively coding, I felt like it just did a lot and made everyone feel more secure and like, yeah, like we know what the robot's going to be like and we're confident that it can work. So basically, just to really hit home this point, for the mech team, everything that moves or like has a light that blinks requires something, even if it's like the smallest thing on the CS end. So that's the drivetrain, and any pneumatic systems, which we had not this past year, but the year before. All of the belts and rollers we had this past year. They're just like, you just need to, even if there's nothing you need to do actively, you just need to remember that in the end, like somebody has to code these things on the button board that we had and the remote and just everything. And then, like I said before, this includes the shifting understanding of what the robot does, because if that changes, like everybody needs to know that it changed. Okay, now it's Ananth's turn, and I'm gonna get my laptop charger.
Okay, great. Okay, so as CS is working on the code for the robot, it's really important that we organize our code in a way that it's important and easy to understand. And we typically work with a library called WPILib, and it has these built-in features called subsystems and commands that allow us to do this without any extreme amount of effort. So code that we typically make is organized into either subsystems or commands. And when we use both of these things in a robot, we call it a command-based robot. So, so quickly, I'll just go over what a subsystem is and what a command is. A subsystem is like a collection of hardware. So if you have a couple of motors and your purpose is for like those motors to control how the robot moves, then you could call those motors one separate subsystem. So in that sense, the drive base would be considered a subsystem because it is, a subcomponent of the entire robot that whose pieces all work together for one common goal. Likewise, you could think of so on the other end, you could think of like a command as an action of a certain subsystem. So for example, in autonomous, we use commands, and those commands essentially allow the subsystem to do specified behavior. So I would say so one time we had this command named drive forward, and all it would do is make a subsystem control the motors to go forward. So commands are all in relation to some particular subsystem, and they carry out actions for that subsystem. So here there's like a level of abstraction. Subsystems are like implementations of hardware in the actual CS, where commands are like the implementation of the functionality that we want. So, and this kind of goes back to what Caitlin was saying. It's really important for the programmers to understand what the functionality of the robot needs to look like, because at the end of the day, we're making these commands and those are controlling the subsystems. So on the next slide, we'll find a little bit more about how subsystems and commands work together. Okay, next slide. All right, so as I said, commands are essentially a way for a subsystem to carry out a specific action. So that might be making a motor run in one particular fashion, or that might be like scheduling like an arm movement. And it's really important, since commands are basically functionality that we want the robot to do, we need a way to schedule these commands. And the way I look at it, there's two main ways. And there's static scheduling and there's dynamic scheduling. What I mean by static scheduling is sort of like what we use in autonomous. In autonomous, we have a rigid schedule of what the robot needs to do. So 2 seconds for the robot to go forward, 1 second for it to turn on the shooting motor, 2 seconds for the intake to run. And that's what we mean by static scheduling. We have predefined times that are essentially hard-coded into our code. And the commands basically just use those timings to run. On the other hand, we have dynamic scheduling, where we don't hard-code it. Dynamic scheduling depends on the presence of certain factors in order to activate the running of a command. So that would be, a certain sensor activating. So for example, if we have an intake and a sensor in front of the intake detects that there is a ball, right? That would trigger the command for the intake to run. And that would be an example of dynamic scheduling. Another instance could be like binding a button on the joystick to running a certain command. So for example, pressing the A button on the controller will automatically execute, like, I don't know, detecting the limelight and making the robot move towards that target. Well, having the limelight detect a target and then having the robot move towards that target. So dynamic really depends. So again, dynamic is dependent on other factors, and that's how we schedule commands. And another important point is that commands can be configured to interrupt other commands. So at any point in time for a subsystem, there's always a command running. So there is a level of priority given to other commands. And we can talk, and we'll see a little bit more about how CS specifically interacts with hardware on the next slide. So next slide. All right. So this is where essentially CS meets mech. And this mostly occurs on the electronics board. So number one is the CAN bus. So as we talked about in one of our prior workshops, the CAN bus is how components on multiple components can connect using one continuous circuit. Now, for CS, we actually need to configure the CAN bus in a way that we can like refer to components on the CAN bus and we can make them do specific things. And for that, we need interaction with mechanical in order to actually wire up everything on the CAN bus. But then on the programming end, we use utilities to configure the CAN bus so we can refer to components from Java or from WPILib. So that's one place where CS needs to work with mechanical to ensure that wiring works and how everything is configured, like is configured in a sense where, CS knows what they're doing and they know that this component corresponds to this value. And mech also knows that everything will like functionally work. The other place is the RoboRio. So as we talked about in a different workshop, the RoboRio is sort of like the brain of the robot. That's where we upload our Java code to. That's where all of the processing happens. So one place where CS needs to interact with mechanical on the RoboRio is data inputs. So sometimes we have sensors, like this can be like light sensors, this can be touch sensors. An example of a touch sensor would be like a bump sensor. So all of those plug directly into the RoboRio in typically analog inputs or I2C ports. And essentially for that, we need to ensure that wiring works, like power delivery is all good. Because many of these components need to have their own power delivery. Like for example, the limelight needs to have its own configuration for power. Essentially for like the data inputs would be like sensors and stuff. So mechanical needs to make sure that there's like functionality for all those things, whereas programming needs to know like on the RoboRio, where is everything plugged in? So we can actually refer to it in the Java code. Because so we have indexes corresponding to components on either the CAN bus or the RoboRio, like the sensors, and programming essentially needs to know so we can hard code that into our software. The other place where CS meets mech on the RoboRio is the supporting electronics. And let me remember. Yes, supporting electronics essentially means like, for example, it could be like networking to the RoboRio because there is a robot radio that the RoboRio uses for communicating back to the driver station. With some of that, it requires that, again, power delivery, wiring. I know that like there's special wiring that we need to use for each of our components. For example, for our robot radio, we have to use a specific power over Ethernet delivery. So there's all these specific things that mechanical needs to handle while CS also needs to know what's going on in order for CS and mechanical to work together. So that kind of goes back to that quote. It's really important to have the functionality to be able to do something, but it's also important that we can implement that functionality in the code. So mechanical needs to ensure that everything on the CAN bus, everything connecting to the RoboRio is all wired together and it will work. But at the end of the day, CS also needs to know that, hey, this has been wired here. This is the port that you need to configure in your code. So it's kind of impossible to make a robot without having the interaction between CS and mechanical because everything is so intertwined. All right, I think that is the last slide. So I hope that explains a little bit more about why CS and mechanical really need to have that active communication with each other. Because as Caitlin said, at the end of the day, everything needs to be programmed.
Are there any questions for either Caitlin or Anand? Okay, if there aren't, I will stop this recording.